Namaste everyone, and welcome to another virtual Vichar Manthan. I hope you're all well and staying safe. My name is Pragna Shikotra, and I'm a member of the London chapter. Vichar Manthan comes from the Sanskrit, meaning churning of thoughts or ideas. VM is a voluntary organisation that engages with speakers who are experts in their field to explore issues facing modern British society so that we in turn can challenge our own assumptions and churn out some deeper insight. If you like the work VM is doing, then please support us by becoming a well-wisher. You can do this by visiting our website, www.vicharmanthan.org, where you can find information on past events and the very distinguished speakers who have graced our panels. While the VM is going on, please feel free to write comments and questions via our live stream platform. Our chair for this evening is Ajay Mistry. He was born and brought up in Manchester and is a graduate in natural science from the University of Cambridge. He currently works in the fintech industry in London. So I'm now going to pass you over to Ajay, who's going to introduce the topic for this evening. Over to you, Ajay.
Thank you, Ragnaji. And thank you all at home for tuning in tonight on this Vichar Manthan, Is Britain Unequal? Today, we've got 3 speakers joining us who'll be sharing their thoughts on inequality. To keep it interactive for you at home, I'll be asking you some questions, some polls. Please write down your answers on the Facebook feed. And we also invite you to post your thoughts, comments, and questions, and we'll come back to those and try and answer them in the question and answer session. The format for today's Vichar Manthan will be that each speaker will have about 8 to 10 minutes to give their opening remarks, and then we'll move on to a 30-minute panel discussion. After that, we'll come to the audience Q&A questions for about 20 minutes before wrapping up. If you've just joined us, our topic today is how unequal is Britain? During my preparation for today's topic, I came across some alarming stats. The UK's 5 richest families now own more wealth than the bottom 13 million families. And over the last 10 years, the number of billionaires in the UK has almost doubled. But it's not just about the money. Extensive research shows that the first few years of a child's life, in terms of social integration, healthcare, and education, all have a large effect on their future outcomes and positions. There are real-life impacts. The International Monetary Fund has shown that income inequality undermines economic growth. The research has shown that countries with greater levels of inequality also have higher levels of mental and ill health, violent crime, imprisonment, drug and alcohol addiction, and they also show lower levels of educational attainment, social mobility and trust. So how do we define equality? And what are we looking for in equality? Is it the equality of outcomes, the things that we have or attain? Or is it the equality of opportunity, what we have access to? And what implications does that have on the society as a whole? To start us off, we have our first speaker today, who's Dr. Jamie White. Jamie won the Bastiat Prize for Journalism in 2006. He's the author of the books Quack Policy, Free Thoughts, A Load of Blair, and Crimes Against Logic. Jamie has held a diverse range of positions in his career. In 2014, he was the leader of the ACT Party in New Zealand, and until 2019 was the Director of Research at the IEA. Jamie has previously worked as a management consultant and also as a philosophy lecturer at the University of Cambridge. Jamie, if I could hand over to you to give your 8 to 10 minutes of your opening remarks.
Okay, well, the first thing to say is that, of course, Great Britain is an unequal place, United Kingdom, unequal in terms of outcomes and of opportunity. But it's worth just, hopefully what I'm going to try to do here is just give a little order to the discussion. So it's important that we make some distinctions and understand some different ideas that are often going under the same labels, and it can cause some confusion. So, of course, the first one, and it was mentioned in your blurb summarizing this discussion, is the distinction between equality of outcome and equality of opportunity. So equality of outcome, people normally mean economic outcome. So you would have equality of outcome if everybody earned the same income, if everybody had the same amount of wealth. Now, before moving on, I think it's clear that we don't even want that. Now, a lot of people say, well, they might think it's an unrealistic goal, but we would want it if we could get it. Well, no, I don't think we even want it. And the reason we don't want it is that we have a labor market. So that's to say, some people earn more than other people. That's the job they've got pays more. Why we want that? Why do we want that? Because those different prices in the labor market signal the demand and the scarcity of certain kinds of abilities in the labor market. And so when the demand for something goes up, the price of it goes up, and people respond by providing more of that kind of labor, maybe doing the training they need to do in order to supply that labor. And if we didn't have that mechanism, we just would have a hopelessly inefficient labor market. People wouldn't get the right skills, they wouldn't do the right things. It would all have to be done by kind of command economy, and that would be catastrophic. So we need to have different, we can't have an efficient economy unless we have different levels of pay for different jobs. So nobody really wants equality, absolute equality of outcome. Maybe they want more equality, I don't know, we'll probably get to that. But so that's outcome in terms of income. Now, what a lot of people say is, oh no, of course we don't want equality of outcome, but we do want equality of opportunity. Now, again, it's important, there's an important distinction here. People mean different things by equality of opportunity. They mean two different things, so it's ambiguous. One, what you might call the classical liberal view of equality of opportunity, is that it's a legal notion. That's to say, if everybody faces the same laws, same rules apply to them, then they have equality of opportunity. That's one idea. So for example, if I line up in a sprint race, 100-meter race against Usain Bolt, we, in that sense, and we're both at the starting line, we've got 100 meters in front of us, and the track is flat, our lanes are the same width, we've got an equal opportunity to win that race. But of course, in a certain sense, I've got no chance of beating Usain Bolt, right? So in that sense, we don't have an equal opportunity. And that's what a lot of people mean by equal opportunity. They mean, do you at the starting point have an equal chance of actually succeeding? So when children are born in particular, are they born with an equal chance of getting to the top? So there may be no discrimination against them. There may be no law saying people born called Jamie can't get this kind of a job. There may be no discrimination on the basis of sex or race or anything in the law, but it doesn't follow that everybody has an equal chance of success. And so what a lot of people mean, I think most people nowadays mean, when they talk about equality of opportunity, is that at the start of your life, you have an equal chance of success. Now, I'm not sure what they mean by success. They tend to mean things like becoming a judge, becoming a doctor, being rich, something like that. They don't seem to care about certain things, like, I don't know, winning ballroom dancing competitions, but whatever you mean by success, they want an equal chance of it. Now, again, clearly, in that sense, Britain is not an equal country. People do not have an equal chance at birth. Indeed, I would imagine that, I don't know the details, but what you might call the accident of your birth. So how wealthy your parents are, how loving and engaged and intelligent they are, all sorts of things that weren't in any sense up to you, they're just accidents of birth, play a big role in your life and have a great influence on your chances. Now, okay, so we can all agree on this, and there's statistics that back it up, but I don't think anybody would doubt it. so what? What are you going to do about it? That's the really interesting question. Do we want to, what kinds of interventions do we want to make, if any, to remedy this? And what has happened in the United Kingdom over the last century, roughly, is the development of the welfare state. Welfare state, I don't think, is properly thought of as a remedy for this. It's a kind of compensation for it. So do you see what I mean? So the difference is, it doesn't fix the problem of inequality at birth, but it lessens the pain of it. So suppose I have a bad birth, so to speak. I'm born into unfortunate circumstances, and my life doesn't go as well as it might have on account of that. Well, nevertheless, I get healthcare through the NHS. I get educated by state schools. I might get a state house that houses me. I might get an unemployment benefit. So the pain of disadvantage is lessened. I don't think it lessens the disadvantage, though. So what the welfare state has not actually done, although we've had it now for almost 100 years, is to greatly equalize people's chances of being a success at when they're born. And I won't go on, I think I've probably used up most of my 8 minutes. I'll just put this idea out there, that although it has greatly lessened the pain of an unfortunate birth, in some ways it has exacerbated problems of inequality, because the poor typically get a much worse education than the rich, and I think that they get a worse education than they would get in a privatized educational system in which they had schools competing for their business. And the other idea that I'm going to throw out there, again, rather contentious, but I think it's worth putting out there, is that there's been a great increase in the number of children raised in single parent families, since the advent of in particular, the single parent benefits. And there's a lot of evidence suggesting that children raised in single parent households are at a disadvantage. And so this is just an example of a very common phenomenon, which is called moral hazard. Whenever anything is insured so that the pain of it is lessened, the amount of it goes up. So insured car drivers have more car accidents. Insured parents have more children when they're not in a financial position to do so, when they're not in a stable family. And so you actually sometimes, you inevitably, when you insure something, you get an increase in the quantity of the thing that you're insuring against. And in that way, I think the social welfare system has, as I say, lessened the pain of people in difficult circumstances, but perhaps increased the number of them. And on that note.
Thank you, Jamie. That was perfectly on time. Some very interesting thoughts there on legal inequality and the role of the welfare state, and also on education. And speaking of education, we have with us our second speaker, who's Peter Cramp. Peter is an economist, educationalist, and is the head of economics and politics at a leading independent school. In 2018, his former students ranked first and third in the Cambridge Economics Finals. Peter's the author of economics texts for Anform Limited and has published several books on the labour markets and development economics. He's also the owner of Economics Factory, a small business specialising in economics resources. So, Peter, over to you to your opening remarks, please, if you would.
Okay, thank you very much. So my terms of reference are quite similar to those that Jamie has used in his opening remarks. So I absolutely agree with Jamie that Britain is not equal, either in terms of outcomes or opportunities. And I agree with him that equality of outcome is not desirable. His analysis in terms of the need for wage differentials, for example, for labour market efficiency, I think is absolutely spot on. Now, in terms of equality of opportunity, I also mean something quite similar to the ideas Jamie has suggested. So really the idea that we all start with equal life chances and opportunity of achieving prosperity, primarily in terms of income and wealth. And I think that there's a fairly widespread agreement that equality of opportunity is a desirable thing. And in that sense, probably Jamie is presenting a viewpoint which perhaps is not so widely held across the field. I think most people argue that equality of opportunity is in some sense desirable. Where I want to pick up really here is with my field and education, and the difference that can make in terms of bringing about equality of opportunity. Access to an excellent education is for me paramount in terms of achieving such equality. It wasn't without reason or justification that Tony Blair used to say that his three priorities were education, education, and education. So there's a clear link between education, opportunity, and an outcome. In terms of economic theory, education leads to higher productivity on the part of a worker, and that worker will then generate more revenue for his or her company. And no profit-seeking firm is going to pay a wage to any worker that is higher than the revenue that worker generates for the firm. So good education leads to higher earnings. And the stats, of course, would back that up as well. That there's a premium to education. The higher you go in education, the greater the wage return to that. So education has got a huge part to play in the debate about equality. And I think for true equality of opportunity, you're really seeking access to excellent education for all, and from the earliest point in their lives. So we're talking about great education from early years through primary, secondary, further education, higher education, and access to great educational opportunities is important in terms of broader equality of opportunity. Okay, I do think on the whole that equality of opportunity is lessened when governments take a step back. Government intervention on the whole, of course, lessens inequality of outcome, but I think also that being brought up in a home with a reasonable level of material prosperity is significant to opportunities, alongside other factors, of course, such as your parents' own educational background and their ability to provide support for your education. So I'm really here tonight to make the argument that great education is key to equality of opportunity. I'm very lucky in terms of teaching in an outstanding school, a truly great school, which is a joy to teach in. And one where access to the excellent provision that we offer is governed primarily by two factors. Now, one of those factors is ability to pay. You know, it's not cheap to come to the school that I teach at. That's not to say that anyone at the school wants to exclude those who haven't got the ability to pay. We strive very hard in terms of raising money for bursary provision to ensure that those from less disadvantaged backgrounds but with ability are able to attend the school. Access to our school is also governed, of course, by selection. So to gain a place at the school, you typically have to come in the top 130 or so in our entrance exam. So what I really want to argue for tonight is for government measures which will weaken the link between ability to pay and access to great education, because I think that's really important to equality of opportunity. However, I will be arguing in favour of selection, I think that selection is important in terms of matching provision of education to the needs of each student. And that's important in determining outcome. So those are the two ideas that I've come along to argue for tonight. Look forward to discussing them. Look forward to being challenged on them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. So yeah, very, very interesting thoughts there, and sort of some parallels with Jamie, especially around education. I think we'll move to our third speaker now, Lucas, and we'll see what his thoughts are. Lucas is Lucas Crabill, who holds an MPhil in Economics and Social History from the University of Cambridge. Lucas is currently an economic researcher at the New Economics Foundation, where his focus is primarily on monetary and fiscal policy. And he's currently working on greening central banks and modeling the cost implications of public policy changes. He's previously worked at the Centre for Progressive Policy, supporting research programs on skills, housing, and the role of business in society. So, Lucas, over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Ajay, for having me here. So I will start with where I agree with the previous speakers before putting forward my own argument for the discussion today. So I think we are all agreed now, adding my voice, that yes, Britain is an unequal society in many measures, in many respects, including economic outcomes, economic inequalities, but also other measures. And I think we also agree in terms of strictly speaking about the equality of outcomes, that it's not desirable that there is absolute equality of outcomes, that no matter what your skills, what your efforts, so on, that you should get to the same place as, or even in a less extreme version of that. I think clearly we need wage differentials, and we need some role of the market, you know, in determining the people's level of pay and so on. So it seems we are all agreed. And yes, things like selection in education, I mean, obviously we want to make equality of opportunity to apply to everyone available, but still there needs to be some sort of a selective approach based on people's abilities. So with that agreement outlined, I would like to speak a bit more about, again, as Jamie pointed out, we have different understandings or different interpretations of, say, equality of outcome and different terms that come up in this discussion. So, as I said, I agree that, yeah, complete equality of outcome is not desirable regardless of people's skills, occupations, and so on. But there are important differences in equality of outcomes or inequalities of outcomes that can be determined by other things, and where we may think it's actually not something that we should be accepting. So in preparation for today's discussion, I've been just going again through a Social Mobility Commission report, the State of the Nation 2018-2019, where they produced a whole lots of statistics about social mobility in Britain. So maybe I'll briefly explain the concept of social mobility, or at least the way they approach it. So social mobility would be essentially whether you as a person end up in your life in a better, mainly in economic terms, or in terms of your occupation, in a better place than your background, so the background of your parents. So for example, if you're starting with a background in a working class, your parents in the working class, what is your chance of moving upwards to become a professional, say lawyer, accountant, economist, and so on? So social mobility is, yeah, the process in which people are able to move, well, they can move up or they can even move down as well, but the movement between these different social strata. And yeah, in this report, they find that besides of your occupation and skills and so on, generally your parental background plays a big role in how far you can go in British society, and you are generally much more likely to get a better job or achieve better pay depending on your parents. So maybe I won't bore you with too many stats, but maybe I will cite like 2 or 3 most striking numbers. So for example, they find that people with better or professional backgrounds, so where parents are in this so-called professional occupations, are almost 80% more likely to get a professional job than people from working class backgrounds. So, which is a striking difference. You have much better chance to get one of those more desirable, better paid occupations if your parents already come from that background. And as a result of that, people from working class backgrounds on average earn 24% less a year than those from professional backgrounds. So yeah, it can be because they're in a different job style, because of the market logic, they're paid differently, but their findings suggest that they end up in those jobs to some extent, obviously not fully, but to some extent, they're more likely to end up in those jobs because of their parental background. So I think when we speak about the equality of outcomes, again, we shouldn't strive to have 100% of everyone, getting the same pay and so on. But clearly, we need to pay attention to things like your ethnicity or class background. There were findings also about ethnicity, that if you are from certain ethnic backgrounds, especially non-white or black or Asian or Caribbean backgrounds, you are less likely to earn well or progress in the society. So it's a more complex picture, I think, and your skills or the work you put into don't account fully for where you may end up in the market logic. So depending on how many time I've got, I would move on to my point about health. I think I was meant to track my time and I forgot to press the start button, but so cut me off when I'm approaching the middle button.
Few more minutes.
Okay, so I very briefly move on. So when I'm thinking about the equality, so yeah, we kind of talk about equality very much in education, and then your economic opportunities or economic outcomes, that kind of job you can get. But I think in the current context, it's also very valid to look at your health and where are inequalities in health, in health outcomes in Britain, especially during the pandemic we have now, and what this can tell us. So recently there was a 10th anniversary release of a so-called Marmot review, which it was a report released in 2010. It was a landmark report about the healthcare and generally health of the nation in the United Kingdom, led by Professor Marmot, who's a healthcare expert, and alongside with his panel. And the interesting finding, the very striking finding of this panel is, well, I would say there are 2. So one, it's not just about the health system. It's not just about the NHS. So, I mean, we need to fund it properly, but it's not everything. There are other things that play a very big role in your health. And because NHS or any sort of health system, whether public or private, only comes to play when you're actually sick. But why you end up sick? And they find out that there is a very strong correlation. If you look geographically in Britain at areas that are most deprived compared to least deprived. So there is a governmental measure, the government produces statistics called Indices of the Multiple Deprivation, which is basically ranking local authorities in Britain on a whole set of established statistics and measures about how well or how badly they do economically and in social terms. So the most deprived areas have significantly lower average expectancy, life expectancy. So basically how long you will live. And this also applies to your healthy life expectancy. And if you happen to live in one of the wealthier areas, which there is very strong correlation, wealthy areas with high average incomes is also likely to be among the least deprived. Your life expectancy is also very likely to be significantly higher. And in terms of years of healthy life, the difference, I'm just looking at the graph here, is over 10, is about 15 years between a couple of authorities at the very bottom in Britain and a couple of authorities at the very top. So that's healthy life expectancy. So that just shows the whole scale of health inequalities. I mean, almost based on where you are born or where you live, you can end up living much shorter. So obviously it's the place itself does determine it, but because you are in a place that is poorer, you are more likely to have a bad job, and you are more likely to be poorer in general, and then you are more likely to lack money for healthy lifestyle and so on. So, I mean, I would say geography itself determines it, but the economic and social conditions of the place where we live determine it. So I think that's very striking, and in this updated report 10 years on, they found not much has changed. Actually, things have perhaps gotten worse, that the life expectancy in England has actually stalled. That was something that year on year or decade to decade would expect that the average life expectancy across the country would be going upwards because of improving medical treatments and so on. But what they found is actually not happening.
Lucas, can I jump in there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's some really interesting points, especially around healthcare as well, which I think we can dig a little bit deeper into in a moment. But both of our other speakers here and yourself as well have pointed out that education is primary, is paramount to equality rather. Maybe Peter, we can start off with yourself. I mean, you said that you work in a private school, and you know the grades that your students come out with are absolutely fantastic. But the bottom line is that there's a limited number of places in the school, and so for people to have access to Peter as a teacher, you know, those who can't necessarily afford the school fees are at a disadvantage. So how does being at a private school, being a teacher there, weigh up against educational inequality?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of the education we provide, it is, you know, without question, outstanding. And I don't think that anyone should have any sort of problem with excellence. And the performance of our students makes huge contributions to the broader economy in due course. So for me, any debate about equality is about levelling up rather than levelling down. So you know, we shouldn't be going after private schools that provide outstanding education, you know, and seeking to abolish them or to take away their charitable status. But we should be trying to make access to that quality of education more broadly available. So this is where I'm coming from when I talk about weakening the link between ability to pay and such excellent education. Now, as a school, we do what we can to try to weaken that link. You know, we would like to have such broad provision of bursaries if it were possible. And we already have quite a number. We'd like to make that very much broader. You don't have to go back very far in time to find a point where the government actually used to assist people from poorer backgrounds to come to schools such as ours. So there was some assisted places scheme, which was actually introduced by the Thatcher government in the early 1980s. And abolished by the Blair government. And you know, although I supported in my talk, you know, Blair's emphasis on education, that's something that I think he got wrong. I think that yeah, that measure served to deny access to some excellent education provision to people who really would have benefited from it. I want to broaden this to finance for education at all levels. And here we're talking about, you know, access to a great private school, but that link between funding and quality of education, I think, is important throughout. And it begins, you know, preschool in the early years, but additional money for nursery education can have great benefits, both for the pupils who are able to enjoy that nursery education, getting off to a good start in life, and for their parents to be able to go out and work and bring additional income into the household. So I'm really arguing for increased funding for education and increased access to excellent education at all levels. And going beyond the level I teach at, I finish at age 18 with A-level students, access to university. Over the last few years, we've seen the introduction of significant tuition fees. There are very few students now who benefit from significant maintenance grants. And it would be my view that access to university education is now significantly more limited on the basis of ability to pay than it used to be. Yes, there are borrowing facilities available for people to go to education, go to university, but actually you're far more likely to go to university if you've got significant prosperity in the family, such that you're not dependent on that borrowing. So at the moment, I think there's too great a link between the ability to pay and access to good education at all levels. And I think there would be a case for greater government intervention to help weaken that link in the name of equality of opportunity.
So, Jamie, Peter's talking there about closing the gap in education through bursaries and scholarships, various funding opportunities. But, you know, private schools still have the ability to select their students and have smaller class sizes. They don't even have to follow the national curriculum, particularly to the point. So, you know, they can adapt their education and what they teach. How does that play into, you know, the benefit to benefiting everybody in terms of education?
It would benefit everybody if that model were applied universally. So that's to say, they have control over their own admissions. They can set whatever tests they want, or none if they want, to let students in. They can charge whatever fees they want. They can follow whatever curriculum they want up to a point. Of course, their students have to get certain exams, and they have to teach them for those exams. And there are also some actual governmental restrictions on what they, requirements for what they teach. But what I mean, it would work if everybody got it. I mean this. I'll use an analogy. Suppose that instead of intervening in the late 19th century, the government started supplying education in this country. Prior to that, it hadn't. Prior to that, schools were private or by charitable. So there were the famous public schools, there were church schools, and there were these private schools as well, fee-paying schools aimed at, you know, ordinary kids. Then in the late 19th century, the government started supplying education through state schools. Now, suppose that they had done something similar with cars. So they decided, okay, in the 1940s, they thought cars would come along. Everybody has a right to a car, right? Why should only the rich have a car? Everybody's going to have a car. We're going to have a state car. It'll have to be a pretty cheap car, of course, because we can't supply everybody with a Rolls Royce. So we'll introduce these cars. Now, what would happen? Well, wealthy people would say, well, I don't want that crappy state car. I'm going to opt out. I'm going to buy a car on the private market. The private suppliers of cars would only produce expensive cars, right? Because who's going to buy a cheap car when they can get a free cheap car from the government, which they've already been taxed to pay for? So now you get the split market in cars. You've got everybody taking the state car if they're not rich, and the rich opting out and getting a privately made car. The private sector, the rich are getting manufacturers of cars, catering to their preferences, competing to get business. The state supplier of cars, under no such normal commercial pressures, just produces the crappy old car that it wants to produce, that suits it, gets ideas into its head about, oh, I think people should have this kind of car, or they should have that kind of car. No incentive to provide a good product to their customers, because they haven't really got customers. And this is exactly what we have in the education market, the state has crowded out the private sector for all but the rich. So only the rich have normal businesses chasing their voluntary patronage. And we need to reintroduce that throughout the system. And then you would find that people would come up with really clever ways of educating kids from a lot of different backgrounds with a lot of different abilities to give them the best that they can at the costs, you know, at a reasonable cost. The government, by the way, could pay the money. It just shouldn't provide the schools, right? For example, when you're unemployed, right, the government doesn't give you food. It gives you money to go down to a supermarket and buy the food. If the government gave you food instead of money to buy food, I can tell you the poor would be getting really terrible food. So I think I want a lot of what Peter wants. I'm not exactly sure how Peter wants to bring about what he wants, which is, I think he wants something much more definite than I want. I just want market forces opened up for the poor. I'm sure some of those schools would be selective, some wouldn't, I don't know. We would find out, but I'm sure that if you could do that, you'd find that poor kids would get a much, much better educational deal than they do at the moment.
Lucas, what do you think to Jamie's point there? Do you agree? Does this analogy of you know, private and state-funded cars apply to education? Did it work? Do you agree with what Jamie's saying?
So I think what Jamie said applies to certain sorts of products and services, but not to everything. So I wouldn't see a car at the same level as, say, providing education to children, or something like providing healthcare. Because a car, I mean, may be a necessity for your work to commute, but you can get there with any car. And anything above that is basically your, you know, sort of vanity, want to have a nicer car, shiny car, so on. And I mean, for that sort of, you know, quality of goods for your enjoyment, clearly, yes, market is the best solution. So I mean, coming back from Poland, we had, you know, experience with real socialism, and it hasn't worked out that well for, like, you know, luxury goods, consumer goods, and so on. So clearly, market is the most efficient and the best way to provide certain sort of goods or services. But I would disagree on the point that it applies to everything, or things like that we believe that they're so essential that they are pretty much human rights. So providing education to children, I don't think it should be left entirely to market forces. And maybe I come up with another analogy, which I think something that is closer to providing education than providing cars. So we can think about healthcare systems. And, you know, we have a state-dominated, pretty much state system of healthcare in the UK, the NHS, where everyone has a right to free access. Well, I mean, with paying prescription fees, and, you know, there is not so clear-cut in some circumstances, but in general, free to access for most cases, for most people, most of the time. And look at how the market has worked out in the United States. How well is this going for them? I mean, the spending, the percentage of the gross national product that the United States spends on healthcare is ridiculous. It's something way, way higher than any other comparable advanced Western economy. And what are the outcomes? I mean, I'm sure there's amazing healthcare for people who can pay it. If you have, you know, private health insurance, you pay a lot of it, or subscribe to private hospital. I mean, yeah, it's great. It's absolutely amazing. But for all the people that before Obamacare, it was even worse, but even now there's a lot of loopholes, a lot of exemptions. You're pretty much tied down to your employer, and then they need to pay for insurance, and it's normally not great. As soon as you lose your job, which can happen in a free market economy as US, there's no notice period in most cases. They can just fire you. At that moment, you lose your insurance. And all the statistics show that the health outcomes in the United States are extremely unequal. And if you don't belong to a group in society with high earnings, high wealth, ideally white and living in one of the big cities, I mean, your outcomes are very bad. If you belong to Black community, your health outcomes are really bad. So the market, it looks like it has driven up the prices, driven up the costs, and maybe it provides better quality for a segment of society, but it doesn't work for everyone. And I think education for children is something much closer as an essential thing. It's not because you feel like having it, you need it. Children need education, and people need healthcare when they get sick. And I think.
So talking about children there, and Peter, you brought up this point earlier as well, I think. You know, there's this kind of idea of a home learning environment when you're in your first, when your first environment that you're in. On the one hand, we've got this formal schooling environment, and on the other, this informal home environment. And clearly, some children are fortunate enough to be brought up in in a supportive environment, like Jamie mentioned. So how does social and governmental help create that supportive environment? Jamie, you said that the welfare state helps to reduce the pain of inequality, but does it still provide talented students to get to where they need to? Or
So
where
I think you switched. Are you talking about, do you want me to answer that or Peter?
Well, Peter, let's go to you first.
Okay, so you asked about early years, preschool, and what role the government can play there. I think one of the key issues here is aspiration. So a lot of children in their early years and their primary years are brought up in households where they don't have examples of working adults in the household. They don't have anyone who sort of plants ambition in their lives. I think that's a really difficult area for the government to influence significantly. Other than in terms of promoting messages of aspiration, which is something as schools that is definitely part of what schools try and do now to plant the seeds of aspiration in their students and to give them big dreams. The other thing here, I think, is essentially breaking the poverty cycle, because what we've got going on is a situation where those who are brought up in poverty often are growing into adults in poverty and then raising their own children in poverty. And I think that education plays a key role potentially in breaking that cycle, because the first generation who gets off to a really good start in life with a good education then escapes that poverty and is less likely to bring up the next generation in poverty. I think in terms of what the state can really do in those early years, I think access to nursery education is really important. I don't think that nursery education needs to be terribly formalised. I think that in those early years, children learn an awful lot through play rather than following a structured curriculum. But the opportunity to be in a nursery education setting with children from their own background and from others, with supportive staff on hand, I think that's really important in terms of equality of opportunity. And I think I suggested earlier as well, but that nursery education also gives their parents a greater opportunity to go out and work, which also is important in terms of reducing poverty.
Jamie, then, does the welfare state really help break this cycle of poverty? Is it doing enough, or is it doing the right thing?
Well, I mean, you can make interventions that are individually useful. So I've seen some of the research around preschool or early years, whatever they call it nowadays, and it seems that it has beneficial effects over the long run. A lot of this data comes from Scandinavia. Scandinavia is always difficult to use because Scandinavian societies are rather different from Britain as it is today, and it's not clear that what happens there would happen here. But let me just give you an interesting fact, right? Which is, so the state interventions can often have unintended consequences. They almost always do, in fact. Here's an interesting one. I mentioned when I first spoke that the number of children raised in single-parent families has grown enormously since the introduction of benefits for single parents. It's gone from about 5% of the population of children to 25%. And that's a pretty standard figure all around the Western world. And they brought in these benefits at the same time all around the Western world. Another interesting side effect is that the rate of adoption has collapsed. So I'm a native New Zealander. In New Zealand, when I was a boy, and up until that point, about 1 in 7 children was adopted. And now it's close to 0. I mean, it's almost finished, adoption. One of the reasons, of course, is that people used to adopt our children that they couldn't afford to raise. So, teenage girl gets pregnant, she can't, they adopt it out. Now, those children went into homes that really wanted them, right? I mean, that's adoptive parents really want those kids. And you mentioned this kind of nurturing environment in which, it gives you an advantage in life. Well, they got it. There are some problems apparently of being adopted in itself, but that's unavoidable. So they got these environments. I mean, I read something once about the number of words that an infant hears spoken to them in the difference between a middle-class home and a kind of benefits family situation. And it's staggering. It's just the little kids in some families are not hearing, they're not being spoken to, except, get out or shut up. That's about the only words they hear. So these are profound differences in somebody's life. And it's very difficult for the state to do much about that. I mean, unless you want highly interventionist kind of state, which, by the way, they do have in Sweden. The Scandinavian countries will take children away from their families much more readily than they do in the UK. I don't think we probably want that. I don't. On the other hand, I don't want to encourage a whole lot of children to be born into families where they're not being cared for. So I don't, I understand the motivations of the welfare state, absolutely. Nobody can behold the poverty that used to exist in Britain before the First World, Second World War, and not want to do what you can to alleviate it. But it has unintended consequences.
You're talking there.
My own offspring's annoying me now, sorry.
No worries.
Sorry, excuse me.
You're talking there about the early years, especially of children in different families. And I think that touches on the point of what Lucas was saying earlier about social mobility, that children in different environments learn and hear different things, and they can be picked up and adopted and put into different socially mobile environments.
Let's do an anecdote and then I'll shut up, right? And I'll really be quiet. It's from my time in politics in New Zealand. So as you mentioned, I was a leader of a political party. And one of the great supporters of my party, she even donated some money to it, had a company running, she had a business, she had preschools, that was her business. In New Zealand, about half of them are privately owned, but the government pays. You don't have to pay. You get 25 hours a week free, paid for by the government. And when this policy was brought in, she was trying to recruit new customers, and she would send her staff around to the homes of the poor families in the area and where her businesses were, and say, look, you can send your kids in here, they'll have a great time, it'll be good for them. You don't have to pay, it's completely free. They couldn't be asked because they had to take the kids in, right? The effort of actually just taking them in and picking them up was too much of a cost to them to be bothered to do it. And I was dumbfounded by this, but she swore it was true. And that it didn't matter that it was free, it was still too much effort. And that's the kind of thing that it's extremely difficult for a government to intervene on once you've got kind of, these kinds of parents.
So maybe, Lucas, we can bring you in there. Peter's talked about education. Jamie's talked about social, like the social status. So I think we can sort of get this underlying feeling that education is important in understanding our social mobility and where we are on a social ladder. Clearly, people have moved up and down that social ladder, whether that's via through adoption or through their own hard work. But maybe you can just drill into what do we mean by social mobility a little bit more, and what are the kind of drivers that affect social mobility, because it's clearly not just education.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just go back to my notes. So yeah, I mostly relied in preparation on the Social Mobility Commission, which, judging by the name, I would hope they know what they're talking about in terms of social mobility. So the way they talk is social mobility is fundamentally about ensuring that a person's occupation and income are not tied to where they started in life. So something that I touched upon before, that basically social mobility is that your outcomes, while they will be influenced by the work you put in and your skills, they statistically should not be influenced to a big degree by the fact that your parents were perhaps something else that you were, or maybe the same thing. It should just be I think Jamie, it was to say, like, the accident of lucky birth, which I agree, like, it is an accident. It's a lucky for like a good family, but like, if not, there's nothing we can do about that fact. Being born in this situation, but after what happens after, to an extent, we can intervene to help in society those children to kind of divorce themselves from this pure accident of luck within our society and still achieve what otherwise their skills enable them to do. That would be social mobility. And yeah, there are a couple of concepts related to that. So I mean, income mobility, whether your level of income remains the same, roughly the same as your parents. So I mean, roughly the same, I would say, on a social scale, because obviously inflation, the trends in income, everything changes across decades, but where you sit in the society income ladder, I would say. And occupational mobility, so something like, yeah, moving from a working class occupation to what we call professional occupations, again, accountants, economists, lawyers, and so on. But there is something, so yeah, so that's kind of the social mobility kind of defines it, that, yeah, we should see it as a good thing that people move upwards to this more desirable, better paid occupation. But one thing we also could think about in the context of this coronavirus that we have here, so we had all this talk about key workers and who they are and so on. And turns out, a lot of them are actually low paid. They are in those undesirable, say, social working class occupations, lowly paid, and as they used to be called before, but hopefully not for much longer, low skilled occupations. So the ideal of social mobility will move up to become like bankers or lawyers and so on. But, this crisis exposes it that in our society, actually, they may be the key, people working in retail shops. So perhaps there is some sort of failure of market logic that it doesn't reward people who actually do key occupations sufficiently. Like, economists, researchers, we are not key. Like, if we didn't log in, the society can still exist. But we couldn't exist without, shopkeepers who stock the shelves in Aldi. What would we eat? And
so that's an interesting point, maybe, Peter. So I think what Lucas is saying is that people, we can move through social classes, but, maybe we shouldn't be defining them just on how well educated and how much money you've got. Maybe we need to redefine how we define, social classes. What do you say to that?
I think that in some ways it might be useful to escape the idea of having sort of definitions of social classes. It's always helpful to be able to measure things and say, oh, there's this proportion of society in this social class based on this income and professional background, and so on. And it's true, I guess, that if you were trying to develop a more useful measure of or more useful definition of social background, it would probably become more difficult to measure, because you'd be putting more factors into your definition.
So kind of changing the boundaries.
Yeah, and typically, I guess in terms of economics and statistics, we're always reaching for that that's easier to measure. You know, so if you change the definition, you get sort of less clear-cut statistics. You know, I do think that there are other things besides income and the professional background of your parents, which are relevant to your life chances. But yeah, whether I would necessarily want to try and manipulate definitions of social classes on that basis, I'm not entirely sure. But certainly this, you know, idea of aspiration, just coming back to what Jamie said about the story where they were giving away free childcare, and you know, parents were not taking advantage of it just because they had to take their kids there. What that really shows, I think, is a lack of aspiration. And so a lot of this is about creating a culture, yeah, in which aspiration is shared, yeah, not just by those who've enjoyed success in the past, but those who are perhaps in sort of poorer circumstances at the moment. And I almost think it would be desirable if we could find a way of making it, how can I put this, socially shameful to turn down the opportunities, you know, preschool education and so on.
So for the audience at home, try and get you involved with a poll. Just put into Facebook the question yes, and your answer yes or no. Do you think private education creates more inequality in society? So you at home there. Just sticking with our sort of social mobility, Jamie, has social mobility in, you know, we're not redefining it here, but from the markers, the boundaries that we already have, has it declined over the past 20, 50 years in the UK?
There seems to be some evidence that it has. Social mobility tends to happen in rapidly when you get changes in the economic structure. So, for example, suppose you had an agrarian society in which, you know, you've got landowners and laborers on farms and so on, and, you know, you're born into certain families and that's how it goes. Now something changed. You get an industrial revolution and we move to factory production and so on. Well, suddenly it's all different, right? So suddenly the ownership of land matters less, certain skills matter more, and you get a big shake-up and people move around. And, you know, we saw that. Then we saw a change towards a more knowledge economy, in services-based knowledge economy in the 20th century, and a lot of movement there as well. One of the things that Lucas is talking about is, he kept talking about, you know, mainly social mobility upwards. Now, there are certain measures of it where it can be that most people move upwards, right? So, for example, if you just look at it as, what kind of a job do you have? Do you have a professional kind of a job or a manual labor kind of a job? Then over the course of the late 20th century, there was a general upward social mobility, right? So most people moved from doing manual jobs to brain-based jobs in some way. So there are other measures, by the way, of social mobility where they're zero sum. So if someone goes up, someone has to go down. But I think that we've been through we're going through another change probably at the moment with more automation. So some people who had done very well over the last 30, 40 years, let's say lawyers and accountants and people like that, whatever it is that makes you prone to be good at that, that's it's not as valuable as it was because, you know, a lot of that's going to get automated away. So I think we go through fits and starts of social mobility on these kinds of grounds. Social mobility, you want a certain amount of it, right? Because if you don't see a certain amount of social movement, you figure the system is rigged. But we do have a fair amount of it. And so the question is, well, how much should you get? Right? In a fair society, how much social movement would you see? And unfortunately, that very much depends on the question of how much, to what extent is talent, let's call it, whatever it is that merits doing well, to what extent is that inherited? So if that was a highly heritable feature, well, in a fair society, it still wouldn't get much social mobility, right? The children of those who are successful would be successful themselves. If the relevant talents aren't highly inherited, well, then you'd expect it to be more or less random. So these are very difficult questions to answer. I mean, I did once have a crack at trying to work out how much social motion you would expect to see in a fair society. And I just couldn't do it because, I mean, think about the skills that make you get ahead in life. Right? So everyone thinks about intelligence, but intelligence is way overrated. Being hardworking, a good communicator, likable, these are all very, very valuable qualities to get ahead in life. To what extent do you get them from your family? I don't know.
So picking up on that point of there are different qualities, surely one of the things which Lucas has mentioned is how healthy you are. If you're healthy, then you're going to have a better chance at life. And Lucas, maybe we can just bring you in on that point now. You said depending on where you live can potentially have an impact on your health. So, even today we're using technology to break down the barriers of geography. Can we use that in the healthcare as well?
Yeah, that sounds like a very wide-ranging question. There's obviously all sorts of ways that technology can be improved, can be used to improve healthcare itself. But what I think is very interesting, like in the context of both technological change, but also what I expect will be probably permanent changes in society, the ways of working because of the current coronavirus crisis. So like nowadays, I mean, all of us who can work from home, and probably way more businesses are now adjusted and adapted to that. So I mean, the opportunity technically existed there for years, if not decades, but I mean, companies were reluctant, they had their offices. So the idea was like, you should still be there regardless whether you actually need it there or can do your work from home or from a laptop. And that, makes a big impact. Like you basically, for a lot of best jobs and best opportunities in the UK, you need to live in London or somewhere around in London and face paying, very high costs of renting there, or not even to say to buy a place there. So that, disadvantages everyone who hasn't got either extremely good education to get extremely well-paying job, or who's not already living there. But, in terms of, this shift caused by the crisis, that you may be able to work remotely. And that means you can work remotely from wherever in the country or even the world. I mean, you could have before, but that was not really accepted by the businesses. So in terms of healthcare, so I mean, one of the determinants of health is the location where you live. Is correlated that there may be not economic opportunities for you. You may have a low-paid job that is stressful, hard, physical, and so on. And you would have to really move to like a big city to have more opportunities for something better. But now a lot of those jobs will become available probably to everyone. And because, your economic situation is a big determinant of your health, more than geography per se. Geography is basically, some regions have less opportunities, some have more. So I would imagine that could have quite some impact, hopefully in a right way. Apart from, what technology can do for healthcare as such, which obviously opportunities are massive, but we will just see what happens with that.
So technology, maybe it does have a role in getting equal healthcare around to everyone in the UK. Obviously, we're lucky enough in the UK to have the NHS. Maybe sort of two questions here. Has the private model in the US healthcare, has it failed? Is it creating more? Is it creating more inequality? And so then, would you say, maybe to Peter, would you say that the NHS is the compassionate arm of our government?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, just looking at the link between government and healthcare. The key thing here is access to healthcare for all, and we provide that. I think there's questions about the model. Earlier on, Jamie drew a distinction in education between the funding of education and the use of market forces in the provision of it. And I agree, but there are two separate questions for, you know, what we've got in the UK is a model where the government funds most healthcare to ensure that it's fundamentally free of charge for everyone. Over the last few years, the government has tried to introduce more market forces into the provision about healthcare, essentially creating an internal market where GP fund holders spend money and hospitals compete for business. So, you know, it's not impossible to introduce market forces into a system where the government is paying for provision. And for me, it's the government paying for provision here, which is the key. You know, it has ensured that fundamentally everyone in the UK has access to healthcare in a way that everyone in the US doesn't. And for me, that's got to be a really good thing.
Can I come in here? Because
yeah, Jamie, and just before you do, I just want to go back out to the audience. So audience, another sort of question for you: Does healthcare inequality matter more than economic inequality? So we're talking about income, pay, wealth. So does healthcare inequality matter more to you than economic inequality? Yeah, yes or no? Jamie, if you want to reply.
The American medical healthcare system is far from a free market, and in fact, the reason there's such enormous spending on healthcare in the United States is because of a distortion in the market created by the government, which is that healthcare is a tax-deductible employee benefit. So if I buy you, if I give you $100 extra a week as an employee of mine in America, you get, I don't know, whatever you get, $70 of that after tax, right? If I buy you $100 worth of healthcare, you get $100 worth of healthcare, right? So everybody says, "Oh, I'll take the healthcare, not the money." And there's a massive over-insuring in America. So I mean, you may not know this. It's insane. When you go to the GP in America, it's covered. Just a normal visit to the GP, you know, a checkup, or I've got a sniffle. It's covered by private insurance. And so people massively overconsume healthcare in the United States. And there was a paper done by an economist, it's a long time ago, I can't remember his name, is at Rochester University. Anyway, he estimated that this distortion in the market accounted for about 40% of spending in American healthcare. That's to say, if you got rid of it, healthcare spending in America would drop by about 40%. And then it would be kind of like the level it is in most countries. And of course, this is terrible for the poor because it drives up healthcare costs in all sorts of ways. They're laying on this lavish product for these overinsured people. People who haven't got insurance can't afford to buy it. And of course, the other thing that Lucas pointed out is that it's linked, most people's healthcare is linked to their job. And so losing your job is a bloody disaster in America because you lose your healthcare. So it's a terrible system, but what perverts it is a government intervention, a tax break for providing. I just want to say one more thing on healthcare. The fact that people in poor areas die younger and have more health problems isn't really to do with the provision of healthcare in those places. It's to do with the lifestyles of the poor. So poor people, relatively poor people in Britain, smoke more. So smoking is much more common amongst low-income people than high-income people. They're more inclined to be overweight. They have a worse diet. They exercise less. And as you mentioned, I think they often experience more stress in life. So it's not a healthcare system problem, it's a lifestyle problem associated with low incomes. Having said that, there's a great desire amongst goody-goodies to help the poor by improving their lifestyles. You know, get them to stop smoking, get them to stop eating all that nice fish and chips and stuff and eat, you know, lentils and whatever. Well, I find that annoying. I mean, if you know, here you are realistically looking at your life. I can't afford to go to the opera. I'm never going to own a mansion. I take my pleasures where I can find them. And if I enjoy smoking and I know it'll shorten my life, it may well be a sensible trade-off. It may be the right thing for me to do. And I find this paternalistic trying to tax the poor into submission so that they lead the same kind of lifestyle as the rich, only without the money, right? So they don't, you know, you force them not to smoke and, you know, or do all those things. I think it's cruel. I don't think they're helping them. I think they're imposing a middle-class set of values on people who don't share them and who can't actually participate in all the nice things about the middle-class way of life. And we should just leave them alone. And their poorer health outcomes may be a kind of rational choice on their part, given their wealth.
Very, very interesting, maybe controversial point there. You can see Peter smiling at that. I'm very very conscious of the time, and we've got some questions from the audience. So I just want to bring the audience in here. Before I do, I just want to introduce 3 ideas from Hindu philosophy. In order to create a sustainable environment or society that people can flourish in, we're looking for 3 things, and that's policies and environments which are beneficial for all, that minimizes conflict and harm, and is loving and compassionate. So I've sort of touched upon these words as we've been going along. As we go through these Q&As from the audience, maybe if we can have a think about this framework in when we answer the question. So beneficial for all, conflict, minimizing conflict and harm, and whether it's loving or compassionate. So let's have a look at questions. So we have a question first from Bravar Bedgar, and the question is to Peter. You made comments that often we should abandon selective education in the UK because it hasn't made a significant contribution to mobility.
Okay, so I was actually arguing in favour of selective education rather than against selective education, on the grounds that selective education helps to match education to student needs. So, for example, those who are able to come to a grade school like my own, or possibly a grammar school system within the state sector. Those who pass the entrance exam get an education that's well matched to their needs. I think, at least in theory, you would argue that it's possible then to provide an education to those who don't pass the entrance exam, which also meets their needs. Yeah, I'm not sure that anyone's best interests are served by a one-size-fits-all approach. So you try to make sure that education is matched to the needs of those who receive it. And I think the evidence supports the idea that selective education is actually good for social mobility. So I was reading a study earlier on, research that suggested that the chances of someone from a BAME background going on to Oxbridge are hugely enhanced by living in a selective area.
So talking about being beneficial for all, as a question from Ravi Lakhani to any of the speakers here, in fact, do grammar schools then play a role in narrowing that education disparity?
Well, I mean, grammar schools clearly, I mean, when they were a thing, helped an enormous number of intelligent working class people to be very successful in later life. And it seems to me that you want something like that. Now, I've laid out my view, which is that I want a kind of enormous denationalization, liberalization of the education sector, so that you would see a multiplicity of types of school and so on. But I'm sure that something very much like grammar schools would exist within that, because I think there's demand for it. They've shown themselves to the need well, right? So I'm sure you'd see that. So I mean, really, if you think about Peter's school, I mean, a grammar school isn't far off being. I mean, some of those grammar schools provided really elite education, and they were free, or that's to say, they were funded by the state. And if you have state funding, which I'm in favour of too, and a diversity of provision, you'll see, I think, much better results, because, as Peter said, you'll get a much better alignment of education to student needs. I mean, there is some of this already. A friend of my daughter goes to it's a school that specializes in singing and dancing and acting and all that, but you also do your A-levels, and I think Rita Ora went there, the pop star. And that's a kind of version of that. I'd like to see a lot more of all that kind of thing.
Thank you. We have another question here from Mayur Butt. This is directed to Lucas. Lucas, do you have, or can you provide any stats, and actually to any of the speakers then, if you have these numbers, any stats on equality of educated people from different backgrounds? Do they still have the same job opportunities?
Yeah, so on the spot, I noted some, but let me just find it. But I would, really recommend, is there a way to submit like a thing in the chat, or should I just read out the title of the report that I used as my reference? Because there was a recent report by the Social Mobility Commission that I cited already on a couple of occasions, and it has, I don't know, hundreds of graphs about all sorts of impact, including education. I mean, it's mostly, in fact, about education at all sorts of levels and how it impacts your chances later in life. So I can just tell the report is Social Mobility in Great Britain, State of the Nation 2018-19. So if you just Google that, that's a free report, you can find it. And for stats for now, let me look at something. So the question was really for like your adult professional achievement, right? And not essentially something earlier. So let me scroll through this. Yes, so I think there's something interesting that also comes from Social Mobility Commission, but it's a different report. It was just called Adult Skills Gap. I believe it was 2018 report. So it found that 1 in 4 of the UK's low-paid workers will never escape low pay, a problem due largely to low skill levels. So if you don't have degree level education, or probably even A-levels, and you end up in a low-paid job, you have like 1 in 4 chance that you will never stay in that one.
Is that expected?
Expected as in international comparison, you mean, or something like that?
So didn't the question concern race? Did the question not say, do different racial groups have different outcomes even with the same educational results? Was that the question?
It didn't specifically mention race, but if you have
sorry, I misheard. Sorry, I must have misheard. Sorry.
No, but if you have some stats to share with our audience on that, then we'll.
No, I can't give them. I mean, you've got massively different outcomes by race, educationally, but I don't know if you've got. If 2 people of different races but the same educational outcomes then have better or different, better or worse chances in the job market afterwards. Most of what I've seen suggests that race doesn't play much role once you control for everything else. So However, there's this very funny stuff about job applications. It's not really funny, it's quite outrageous, but people sending off their CVs, the same CVs, but with different names on them, right? So with a white sound, you know, kind of Anglo-Saxon name, or a Muslim sounding name, or Black American sounding name. So, and you get very different rates of being invited to the interview, and that they're in line with the prejudices you might expect. So there is some pretty strong evidence that there's discrimination in the job market.
Yeah, well, I can just pick up on what James said there. I don't have the stats hand either, but I'd be very surprised that if after you'd controlled for all other factors, there wasn't some residual that couldn't be explained by other factors, and that in the end you've got to put down to discrimination. Yeah, I'm sure that discrimination does play a role in outcomes in the job market.
Yes, but the really important thing, and I'm sure you stick with this yourself, is not to let kids think that they've got no hope if they're not white. I mean, you do really, really well. So there is that tiny little thing maybe, but the education's that much and the other bit's that much, right? So there shouldn't be this kind of idea, oh, it's hopeless, there's no point my trying because I'll never get anywhere anyway because it's all against me, right? That would be a bad idea.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've spoken already about the role that aspiration plays, and yeah, I'm with you definitely on that.
Yeah.
So I've got one last question. This comes from Joel. It's rather a long question, so apologies. I'm just going to read it out and then sort of have a brief one-line question at the end of it. So he says, thanks for the thought-provoking content. You've spoken about market forces, but I have a question about democratic forces. Do the panel have views on deficits in civic education in the UK? So about education rights and responsibilities as citizens. Do the panel see that this could be improved so as to better empower those that are less well off, from less well off backgrounds, to the extent that democratic political influence to their benefit, and help society become more equal? How important is civic education to breaking down the poverty cycle? I think that's the crux of the question. And we are running out of time, so if you can sort of keep your answer fairly brief, and maybe if you can put it into the framework of what we mentioned before as well. So yeah, how important is civic education in breaking the poverty cycle?
Yep. So I would argue that it's civic education is certainly important. In my department, we deliver economics and politics, and it's a matter of sadness to me that the uptake for politics is somewhat lower than it is for economics. And I've sometimes made the case within my school for making, say, a politics AS level part of a broader curriculum, perhaps something that all students might do alongside their chosen elective A-level subjects, because I think that it's important that we understand the democratic system in which we operate. And I think that it's fairly clear that if you don't take part in the democratic system, that you're going to have less influence over that system. And so actually to educate people in citizenship and to take part in democracy in order to have more of an influence on democratic outcomes, yeah, I think that's wholly desirable. And we were talking about principles earlier on of something that's compassionate to the benefit of all, and would reduce conflicts. I rather suspect that if people more broadly in society felt that they got a stake in the democratic system, that it would go a long way towards satisfying both those values.
Lucas, does that do you agree with that? And especially in the framework that Peter just mentioned there, does it sort of tick those boxes, do you think?
Yeah, I think Peter has been spot on. That is crucial that people engage. So, for example, one thing that comes to my mind is So older people are much more likely to vote in general elections in Britain than younger people. And then we have a political situation that, the pensions of older people have the triple log, they have been protected. If you look at any welfare statistics, they have been treated much better by the government than the younger people for whom funding for a lot of education has been cut, tuition fees has been increased, and so on. And there's clearly some correlation. Like if you don't turn out to vote, the government will pay less attention to you than if you turn out to vote. And it's not saying that it's a bad thing that pensioners are protected better in this situation, but clearly, yes, civic education is crucial. And as Peter was saying, you need to take part to be heard. And yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, look, we're running out of time. And so what I'd like is just for each speaker to wrap up your thoughts in sort of 2 or 3 minutes on the question, is Britain unequal, and to what extent, and what can we do about it? So maybe Peter, sorry, Jamie, since you started, we'll start with you. And just before we go over to you, I'll go back to the audience as well. Final poll, if you can submit your answers there. Do you feel that British society creates a flourishing environment for the majority? Generally agree, generally disagree. Does the British society create a flourishing environment for the majority? Jamie, your 2 minute thoughts now, please.
I'll try not to repeat anything. Britain's not an equal society. It never will be. But the question is, the welfare of the poor matters most, because they get the rich are already fine, right? So we want the poor to be most benefit from the system. It's a kind of common idea that the way to bring that about is through the state intervention in directly attempting to help the poor. I don't believe that, as I think I've probably got across. And the reason is that people seeking a profit operating in a free market are keen to serve the interests of the people who would be their customers. And if you think about all the people who've got rich in history, really rich, they've on the whole been people serving the poor, not the wealthy. There aren't many wealthy people to serve. I mean, Bezos, I believe, is about to become the world's first trillionaire, they estimate, by 2026 or something. Well, Amazon serves the poor, not the rich. And I think that unleashing market forces would do more, especially in education and in healthcare, would do more to help the poor than the current state-dominated model. Now, I just want to wrap up on one thing. I hadn't known this Hindu trio of ideas, and I just want to tell you why you should all be free market fanatics like me. Benefit for all. Well, a market transaction only happens when both the seller believes he's profiting from the transaction and the buyer. So all market transactions in that sense are benefit for both parties. And if all transactions are market-based and voluntary, well, then everybody's benefiting. I'll get to loving and compassion at last. Minimizing conflict and harm. Well, again, they're voluntary transactions, right? So unlike democracy, where people vote for this and vote for that, there's a lot of force used after the vote's done, right? So you can vote to get other people's stuff and the government will come and take it. So that's conflict and harm going on there. Not again in market transactions, because they've got to be voluntary. And when it comes to love and compassion, well, the government can't make, people are loving and compassionate up to a point. They love their families and their friends, and they're compassionate towards them, and they've got a general humanity and, a framework in which everything's conducted voluntarily. You'll still see a lot of love and compassion. You won't have people trying to rob each other using the government as their agent. And so I recommend all watching to follow me down the path of free market fanaticism.
Great, thank you, Jamie. So Peter, are you going to follow in Jamie's footsteps?
Not entirely, but neither am I going to disagree completely. So we started out, I think all three contributors said that Britain is not an equal society. As a matter of fact, we don't have equality of outcome. And I think it's very difficult to argue that there's equality of opportunity in any meaningful sense. I think one of the things that's interesting that's come out of the discussion is the distinction between government funding for things like healthcare and education, and the use of market forces within them. So the idea that the government can provide the money, but there's still room for a supply and demand side to health and education markets, with some role for competition in that. I have a degree of agreement with the viewpoint that competition raises standards. I want to say something more generally about the role of the government in providing a safety net for the poorer in society, because I think there's a danger that if you follow the arguments of a free market to the extreme, that safety nets get taken away. So we talk about the idea that when the state insures us against something, that it creates moral hazard, that encourages behaviour where the state has to pay up to support us. I think there's a real danger that you can follow that argument and take away a safety net, which is a hallmark of a civilised society. So of the three principles that you've outlined, the one that really strikes home with me is the principle of compassion. And in the end, market economic theory is based on rational self-interest, and the outcomes that the market is capable of delivering, according to economic theory, are based on economic agents following their rational self-interest. And I just think that in a civilized society, there's got to be a greater role for compassion. And I think that over the last few weeks, we've seen very significant signs that actually within society, we do care more about each other than might be acknowledged in economic theory. The degree of compassion that's come out over the last few weeks during the crisis, I think has been fantastic.
Thank you, Peter. So, Lucas, Peter's sort of aligning with Jamie, but he still wants to keep that safety net in place, and we are becoming more of a compassionate society, he reckons. What's your summaries?
Yes, so I will follow up from what the previous two speakers have said, and my take on all that is, again, that there was clearly a debate about the role of state versus the market and how they should play with the things like inequality and so on. In terms of the role of the state, I think there are 2 points. One is about the meaningful choice, whether people have a meaningful choice on something, and that should probably determine whether we use market forces or the state to do that. So I think whether you like, a red or black car, you like iPhone or Samsung, you want, a bigger house, smaller house, there's all sorts of things that you have a meaningful choice. It's your preference, it's, how much, you're willing to spend your money on some luxury or something nicer and so on. And market is perfect to do that. I mean, we tested systems where there was no market economy and it didn't work. So definitely market is the right mechanism to settle those things. But then there are also some things on which you don't really, I would say, have a meaningful choice. Like, can you meaningfully choose not to have a good healthcare? Like, as a minimum and as a maximum, pretty much, we would like to have everyone as good healthcare as possible, or like education of your children. Again, it's not really a meaningful choice that you wouldn't have a good education for children. You always want the maximum, the very top shelf. And I don't think the market forces work for that. Here, I think some universalist goods that we think that everyone would want the very top shelf and deserves the very top shelf. Even morally, I think that's where the state should come in. So that's under the market and the state debate on that angle. But I think also in the context of current crisis, the coronavirus crisis, I think it exposed the big role of a state in pulling the risk. So I've seen the statistics that currently the British government pays the salaries, pays the wages of like something 49% of British workforce, which is public sector employees and everyone on the furlough scheme currently. Most of the economy has been shut down and the government is paying for that. But that's the thing, because the government can do it. It's big. It's pulling the risk. It got money from taxes. It can borrow very cheaply, or basically borrowing rates are so low that the government is actually being paid to borrow money in real terms, because inflation is higher than the interest the government pays on its debt. And some things like, say, the health service, again, it's about the pulling risk that the government is big and we can afford a big system that can take care of emergencies. And coronavirus today, there can be another emergency. There's climate change coming up. So yeah, that links to the Peter's points about compassion. So I mean, we should be more compassionate as a society. But if we are not, or one way of expressing this compassion is also to having this state that we pay our taxes and it can help the poorest in need in certain things. So yeah, I think that's my take on all of that.
Thank you very much, Lucas. And thank you very much to all of our speakers tonight, to Jamie, Peter and Lucas. I think we've had a fantastic discussion on equality and inequality in Britain and what we think we can do to try and alleviate that. And one of the main driving factors, we really looked into education, social mobility and the equality of healthcare. So everyone at home, I'd like to sort of go away and carry on discussing, thinking about these things, especially in the framework that we've tried to put this into. And a couple of questions for you to take away. Do you feel that British society still, or what does British society still need to do to create that flourishing environment for everyone? And secondly, what mechanism would you consider putting in place to reduce inequality? Thank you everyone at home for all your questions. I hope you enjoyed and managed to take part in the polls, and would love to hear what you've got to think of about inequality. That's the end of our discussion for tonight. I'm going to hand you back over to our compere now, Brugnaji, and she's just going to tell you a little bit about when our next Vichar Manthan is. Thank you and good night. Brugnaji.
Thank you, Ajay, and thanks again to our panel for their insight. I, for one, found that very interesting, and it's given me much food for thought. I hope you did too. VM is all about exploration of ideas. It's not about giving solutions. So like Ajay mentioned, I encourage you to take what you've learned this evening on the Manthan in your homes. Keep sending us your thoughts and questions. We'd love to hear your feedback. As mentioned at the beginning, if you wish to support the work VM is doing and would like to become a well-wisher, please visit the website www.vicharmanthan.org for details. Out for the next virtual VM coming at the end of the month, which explores the role of faith schools in British society. Thank you all for watching and stay safe. Namaste.